And over the last few decades, we've begun to see some cracks in this. We've begun to call into question, in some businesses, not many, this idea that human behavior is more than the kind of rat-like seeking of positive stimuli and the avoidance of negative stimuli. And yet, that's our operating system right now, built entirely around rewards and punishments. And here's the problem. Over the last decade, and think about the last decade. This decade, the first 10 years of this century, has been a period of profound and spectacular underachievement. It's extraordinary how little has been accomplished in this decade. It's astonishing in many ways. And I think one of the reasons that we've seen that Motivation 2.0 doesn't work nearly as well as it once did. In fact, it crashes more often than we'd like to admit. And we're seeing the evidence everywhere. We see it in the open source movement, which is powered by people working for free and for fun, which Motivation 2.0 says shouldn't even be possible. We see it in the economic meltdown. Last fall, even Alan F. Greenspan said that the carrot and stick approach had some flaws. Oh, thanks. Appreciate that heads up, Greenspan. We see it in the 18 million of what the U.S. Census Bureau calls non-employer businesses. These are businesses without any paid employees. Now think about it. If you've got no employees, who do you motivate? If you've got no boss, who motivates you? You have to be self-directed. You have to draw the motivation from within. We see it even in more traditional businesses, which don't have the resources or the time or the energy to develop elaborate mechanistic motivational schemes when their jobs, their firm, their entire industry might not exist in a few years. Here's what one employer says to potential hires when he hires on college campuses. Here's what he says to potential recruits on college campuses. If you need me to motivate you, I probably don't want to hire you. Most of all, we see it, as Michaela was talking, in the seismic shift away from routine, algorithmic, left-brain work to non-routine, artistic, empathic, big-picture work. If you want people to do that first kind of work, the kind that's about following a script or getting one right answer, rewards actually work pretty well. They really do. But fewer of us are doing that kind of work. And in this room, almost nobody is doing that kind of work. And for that other kind of work, the creative kind of work, that hinges on intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. In fact, extrinsic motivators can hobble and sometimes crush conceptual breakthrough thinking. And again, this isn't a feeling, this isn't a philosophy, this is a fact. And which leads me back to the candle problem. Let's go back to the candle problem for a second. Now remember, the people who were offered rewards did worse than those who weren't offered rewards. Okay, that's a pretty serious bug in the Motivation 2.0 operating system. How do you explain it? How do you explain it? Here's one way to explain it. All right, I'm going to explain it with a picture. And as I'm a writer, and so I don't like doing this. In fact, the phrase, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," is one of the most evil phrases I've ever heard. But I'm going to show you a picture that I think explains it. Here's what it is. To solve the candle problem, to solve this tough conceptual problem, you need to think widely. You need to think widely. But rewards, those contingent if-then rewards, get people to think narrowly. Get them to think only straight ahead. And so in this case, in the candle problem, the rewards narrow people's focus and blinker the wide view you need to come up with non-obvious solutions, to figure out new uses for old things. Now, what's interesting is that a short time later, Glucksberg did this experiment again, but with a slight twist. It's the same kind of deal. We're going to time you for norms. We're going to time you and say if you do really well, you get 35 bucks. If you do the best of anybody, you get 165 bucks. But he changed the experiment a little bit. This time, he gave people the candle, the matches, the tacks dumped out of the box, and the box. What do you think happened then? This group kicked their butts. This group the group that was getting paid, the group that was getting the reward, totally outperformed that other group. Why? Why did that happen? Because the solution was obvious. What happened is that Glucksberg had transformed this right brain task into a left brain task. And so since people now, all they had to do was race down a very clear path, having that carrot waiting for them at the end of the finish line made them gallop faster. And if you look at 40 years of research on the science of motivation, you see this again and again and again. For those kinds of algorithmic tasks, where you're following a set of rules to a single conclusion, if-then rewards work. If you do this, then you get that. Those kind of rewards work pretty well. But for creative, design-oriented, right-brain tasks, if-then rewards not only don't work, they do damage. And again, to repeat myself, that's not a philosophy, that's not a feeling, it's a fact. Let me give you another example of this. Teresa Amabile at Harvard did a really interesting study of artists, a profession very similar to many of yours. She recruited 23 professional artists from across the United States and asked them to select 10 commissioned and 10 non-commissioned works. Right? Randomly select 10 of your commissioned works and 10 of your non-commissioned works. Then she gave the works, so that we're talking about 460 works of art, to an expert panel who knew nothing about what she was trying to study and said, rate these pieces. Okay? Rate them on technical quality, rate them on creativity. Okay? The folks who were doing the rating were art experts. They had no idea what was going on, why these things were being selected. What did she find in this experiment? Our results were quite startling. The commissioned works were rated as significantly less creative than the non-commissioned works, yet they were not rated as different in technical quality. Think about that. Technical quality is basically a routine, algorithmic sort of thing. Creativity is something very different. Here's the point. If you want people to do things in a certain way, if you want people to do things your way, in a certain way, promising them a reward is usually great. But if you want people to do something new, if you want folks to give the world something it didn't know was missing, dangling that carrot not only doesn't help, it hurts. Here's another example. Researchers followed a group of art students from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, starting in the 1960s. And they did a whole array of interviews, including when they were in art school. And they tried to figure out what sort of the orientation of the artists were. Were they people who were pursuing art for art's sake, or were they doing this because they want to get accolades, awards, praise, all those sorts of things? Then they followed up with these art students 20 years later to see how their careers were doing. Here's what they found. The less evidence of extrinsic motivation in art during art school, the less evidence of extrinsic motivation during art school, the more success in professional art, both several years after graduation and 20 years later. There was a paradox at work here. Here's what she says. It is those who are least motivated to pursue extrinsic rewards who eventually receive them. It sounds like a fortune cookie. But it's not a fortune, it's not a cookie, it's not a philosophy, it's not a feeling, it's a fact. Intrinsic motivation enables creativity generally. Extrinsic motivators, the things at the heart of our Motivation 2.0 operating system, the things at the heart of how most of us run our businesses, can crush it. So if we really want our teams and ourselves to do breakthrough, compelling, lasting work, we need to move past this operating system that clearly isn't working and upgrade it to Motivation 3.0. So what does this look like? Well, it doesn't disregard that first drive. We're still biological creatures. And it doesn't disregard that second drive. We still respond to carrots and sticks. And sometimes that makes a lot of sense. But it's built mostly around the third drive, the drive that scientists like Edward Deci and Richard Ryan and Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi and Teresa Amabile and a whole array of others have been exploring for decades.